Good evening. I'm Steve Kleppen, Planning and Zoning Director for the city. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to walk you through overview of the changes, then focus in a little bit more about South Norwalk. Then happy to take as many questions as you have until the library tells us we have to go. So here's kind of like the order. Just going to give you, like I said, big picture overview of the changes, focus in on District B, and then tell you a little bit about where we're going after tonight. So when we did the 2014 Plan of Conservation, 2019 Plan of Conservation and Development over, one of the goals was to revamp the zoning regulations. I don't know if anybody spent any time with Norwalk zoning regulations knows it's a cumbersome and clumsy document. It's not well put together. It hasn't had an update comprehensively in over 30 years. There are sections of the document that circle back on itself, and unless you know exactly what you're looking for and where and why, it's very hard to make sure all the rules that apply to your property are kind of contained in one section. So it's just not a well put together document. Another thing as well is simplification. Right now, Norwalk has over 30 zones, which is a lot. We're not, that big of a municipality where we need all these different zones. So we wanted to try to simplify that and then come up with something that was simpler and easier to use. Now, I know if you've looked at the document, it can be a little overwhelming, but that's just because it's new. It's not because it's, foreign language. It's just different zoning speak than what a lot of people are used to. Here's the existing zoning map, and the image on the left shows you the legend, which is basically just like what all the zones are. You can see there's a lot of zones. And when you zoom in, this is an area, just zoomed in just a little bit to the east and north of here. And you can see all the different concentration of zones within a small area. It doesn't really have a rhyme or a rhythm as to why these zones were established. A lot of times it seems like the zones grew around what was there as opposed to the city determining what's the best land use for these areas and how do we want these to develop over time. I mentioned the POCD. The idea is to kind of make, for the most part, and it's not a one-to-one matchup. Within the POCD, there's a future land use map, and that future land use. Oh, good question. Thank you. That's the Plan of Conservation and Development. We call it the citywide plan. That's a state mandated document that we have to update every 10 years, and it kind of guides growth and development within the city. So within that document, there's a future land use map. And that map kind of contains, like in the future, more on a classification basis, here's how and where you should develop and why. So we tried to match up the new zoning with that the best we could possible. We follow some smart growth guidance when we put this together. We tried to develop around our transit hubs, our infrastructure, and our job centers. That's where we think the city should grow. And there's, from a common sense standpoint, we think that's the way to go. Another recommendation, yeah.
Is it possible to move this tripod?
That.
Or is that what?
That's
difficult to read the screen.
Sure. Let me hold on. You're talking about the one with the iPad on it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we can probably move that back.
What's that? Oh, that's in the way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, I'll put it back up there.
Yeah.
Also within the POCD, there's a recommendation for a different kind of code to consider. So right now, our zoning code is called Euclidean zoning, which is basically comes from a court case, Euclid versus Ambler Realty, which is an old court case about separation of uses. That's how our zoning is established. There are more modern approaches to doing zoning. One of those is form-based code. Form-based code really looks at the form and massing of the building and how that relates to the street. And so our code we're proposing is a hybrid code. So it adopts and continues some of the Euclidean zoning when you're away from the items I mentioned, such as the infrastructure, transit, and our job bases. So if you're out in the AAA zone, for example, there's really not a lot of change in the zoning. It just looks different, but the premise is the same for that. As I mentioned, we try to focus around development in certain areas. So this map is just kind of a simplification view of things. Up to the top of the screen, which is to the north, that's the Merit 7 area. That's where there's a new train platform in. That's where all the majority of the city's Class A office space is. And there's a new development that was approved last year to redevelop the west side of Glover Avenue to try to make like a TOD area there. The two main areas of the city that the city really focuses its infrastructure and growth towards is kind of where we are now in South Norwalk, and then extending up West Avenue towards the Wall Street area. And I'm going to show you kind of how that's consolidated with the planning going forward. We have a sub area in East Norwalk, which is like a smaller TOD area. And we also look to grow along our Route 1 corridor, which is that yellow line that you see that kind of runs through the middle of the map. I mentioned a little bit about the Euclidean zoning and the form-based approach. Another aspect of that is that our zoning is, I would call a true hybrid code, because we not only do the Euclidean, the form-based, but we also have village district overlays. That comes into play really on the design review piece of it. We have that in East Norwalk in 2 different areas. We also have that design review in South Norwalk, the West Ave Wall Street corridor, and Rowayton. And what that basically does is gives the city the ability to get some outside expertise in terms of architecture and design for certain projects that we want to make sure get things right. The form-based code does a good job of kind of laying out the overall massing of the building and things, but the nice thing with the additional architectural reviews, they really nail down those fine point details on the design itself. The form-based codes, which I'm going to show you some previews of if you haven't seen it yet, is pretty graphic in image intensity, which is hopefully in the long run should be simpler for folks to understand. This is kind of what we're really expecting and anticipating as the city redevelops. So what is a form-based code? So the form-based code has these things, they're called transects. And transects basically, this image shows kind of the Norwalk spectrum of a transect. If you start on the left, which they have what they call CD1 zone. So there's none of that in Norwalk. That would be somewhere where you have wide open spaces and there's really not much going on. And there's a level beyond on the far right, which is that CD5. That's kind of where we sit right now. There's another level beyond that, which is extra dense and extra urban, which you might see in like Manhattan or something like that. So this is the kind of a snapshot of the portion of the spectrum that Norwalk is in. A lot of Norwalk falls into this CD3, CD4, or CD5 categories. So here is the CD5 zone, which is kind of the zone for South Norwalk where we sit right now. Not all of South Norwalk is in CD5, and I'll show you some different areas on the map. But the area where we sit is within the CD5. You might recognize 50 Washington Street there and the park in the front. So that, and actually the library is in the shot on the bottom, kind of right there. On the right-hand side is it's the first page you see within every zone. All the zones are sort of set up the same in terms of how they're laid out. So there's some consistency from zone to zone. There are some very similar things to what we do. We also regulate all the setbacks. We regulate the building height. We just do it a little differently. We regulate how much of the site the building can occupy. But there are some additional standards that are incorporated into this too with the form-based code. And that looks at things like beyond the village districts, the building design, the building massing, the building appearance, additional lighting standards, fencing, walls, some other things that you might not think of, but they're a little more detailed in this regulations. One thing we think people will like is this use table, and this is just one page of about 20 something pages that it falls into. So it breaks all the uses down by category. So this right here is just the one page of the residential uses. At the top, and can you guys see the letters at the top there? Or do me blow that up a little bit? I'm sorry if you can't. Let me see if I can figure out how to blow that up. Nope. It's not. Yeah, I'm looking for the plus button. It's not popping down. Hold on one sec. No. Sorry about that. Well, what I'll do after I'm done, I'll circle back, go onto the website, and I can blow it up a little easier that way. But up at the top, you'll see where it says principal use. All to the left of that are all the city zones that are there. And then on the left-hand side are all the uses. And so within that, it's just a matrix, and it says P, NP, PL, or SPU. So P means permitted. That's the easiest one. NP is not permitted. PL is permitted with limitations. And so what that means is it's permitted in that zone, but there are a list of additional standards that go along with that. And at the end of the use table, all those uses that have a PL next to it are there in alphabetical order, and you can read what the limitation is. Yeah.
What is a community residence as opposed to congregate housing?
I can pop up the definition afterwards and then show you what that is. Yeah, and that's a good, I think you kind of give me a good segue. One thing that's really good about this regulations is it has a lot of definitions. The current regulations don't define a lot of things that are in the text, so it's left up to interpretation. That's really problematic because it can lead to litigation because someone's saying, well, what does this mean if it's not defined? And then the city would say, well, we've interpreted it to mean this, but then there's no guarantee that that's how it'll hold up later on. The last category on there I mentioned was SPU, and that means it's a special permit use in the zone. Another nice feature of this, so the last page we were just at, it talks about all these different things, different types of buildings. So what's a townhouse, for example? What's a cottage? So in another section of the regulations, it has diagrams of what all these building typologies are. And on the right-hand side, it tells you, it has the definition and it tells you what zones those can go in. So that's hopefully is an easy to follow format. And then it breaks those down even further. So this is what's called a mid-rise. And it's just another form of a residential building. It could have commercial on the ground floor, very typical to what you might see in this area. And on that, it tells you the districts or the zones that it's allowed in and some of the specific standards that have to be accompanied by that type of building. So that's there for all the different building types. I'm just showing you one as an example of what you would see. So it's kind of some of the big picture changes, and some of this is not all of it's applicable to South Norwalk, but is applicable citywide. Right now, the AAA zoning is the largest lot zoning in the city, and that equates to approximately an acre of land. We lined up, for the most part, there were tweaks here and there, just to try to like align the boundaries a little bit better. But the the AAA now becomes what's called CD3L, which is a large lot zoning. Really not a lot of changes there. And that's because they're kind of on the outskirts of the city. There isn't the infrastructure in place, and a lot of those properties are on septic. So it makes sense to kind of leave them as they are. So I mentioned the single family zone. So in addition to the AAA, there's a AA, there's a single A, and there's a B. And there's also a C zone, which allows 1 or 2 families. So that's a lot of single family zones for one community. That's 5 in total, technically. So one of the goals that we did towards simplification was to combine those zones. So for the most part, the AA zone, which equates to about 1/2 acre, and the A zone, which equates to 1/4 acre, we combined those 2 zones for a lot of parts. In some areas, that 1/4 acre zone combined with the B zone, which is the smallest solely single family zone. And I can show you some of the map changes to that. One change which affects certain areas of the city, and I know I've had conversations with folks in Shorefront Park and other areas, is the new zone, which is called CD3. That's a 1 or 2 family zone. So you don't have to do a 2-family with the rezoning. That's optional. No, we're not forcing you to do that. It gives you the option to build a 1-family versus a 2-family. Yeah.
In your consolidation over here, you're saying you're putting the AA, single A, B zone in the same sort of zone. Does that mean that somebody that wants to cut their property in half and have 250 by 100s instead of the larger AA 1/2 acre zone? I mean, are we going to be building little tiny houses with little lots next to?
No, so.
We're already compliant with the 1/2 acre zone.
No, so the rationale for joining those 2, the A with the A and the B, there's not a lot of B that goes into that zone. There's just where it was kind of an isolated pocket. It moved just to make sure that ensure the boundary lines made more sense. But the lot widths are the same for the 2 zones between the A and the AA. So you're not going to see a proliferation of subdivisions, for example, where you might see, and this will be true on the AAA as well. And one important point I should make before we get too much deeper in is we're no longer regulating the area of the lot. We're just regulating the width of the lot on the street. And the reason for that is no one can perceive how much land you have unless you're kind of doing an aerial view of things. If I'm driving down the street, I don't see area, I see width. And that width is in relation to the property and what structures are on the property. So we're not changing that aspect of the development. We are requiring, so if the width required for your zone is 100 feet, you're also going to have to put in a 100-foot diameter circle. That makes sure no one kind of like does these crazy property lines and zigzags to try to get the most width and then have property to the rear. We're also no longer allowing rear lots. So that's going to also impact that. Where I think you might see some additional development in the single family areas, if somebody has a corner lot with a pretty good sized piece of property. And that's because if you're on a corner, you have two streets. And so you have width on street A and street B. So you might see another house on a corner lot, but it's not going to lead to 3, 4, or 5 houses or something like that. Potentially. It's no guarantee. The math has to work regardless.
No, it's enough to scare. So you're saying, so if you're in a double A zone, triple A zone, and you're a corner lot, that's a potential for 2 lots.
Potential, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of potential going on right now.
But if you lose the rear lots, that whole piece of the equation's out of it as well.
When you say lose the rear lots, what happens to people who currently?
No
own-
change.
What?
If they have a rear lot already, there's no impact on them.
Their grandfather.
Right.
So if you have your home, there's no more room on your street to build anything more. The only way that a single family home can change to a 2-family residence is if the developer buys it, knocks it down, and rebuilds something on a street that has poor parking for the actual residents to begin with, right?
Right. So,
That's what's gonna happen.
yeah, that was kind of where I left off with the 1 or 2 family. So right now in the new zone, and I'll show you on the map a little bit more closely when we get there. The CD3 zone, which is proposed for 1 or 2 family, you're not required to build a 2 family. That currently you can do an attached ADU or you can do a detached ADU right there. So there's no increase in the, accessory dwelling unit, which is like an apartment. So somebody can do that right now as of right in that zone on any of the single family zones in the city. The new.
That's a recent change.
That was last fall and then modified again in the spring, oh, excuse me, the winter. Where was I going? So within the CD3, you can do 1 or 2 family. Let me just finish up before I forget my thought. So you could do a 1 or a 2 family there. You can also, as of right, with a single family, do an ADU, which is an accessory apartment. It can be attached or detached. So we're giving you the option to do the single family and leave it a single family as much as ever you want it to be. You can do a single family with an attached or a detached ADU, or it can be a 2 family. If you do a 2 family, you cannot do an ADU. So you can't do 3 units. You're stuck at that. So there's no change in the density. If you do a 2 family, there are additional standards related to that. Parking has to be on the site. It has to be to the rear or the side of the building. So with the ADU, you have to provide 1 additional space. A new 2 family, you have to provide 4 spaces, and those have to be compliant spaces. I can't regulate if I have mom, dad, and then the 3 kids are back from college and they don't leave and they all have cars and they overflow. I can't control that. That's not a zoning issue. That's just a quality of life issue. I can't tell you where the legal spaces on the property have to be. With a new development, they have to all comply. So that changes as well. With the CD3, with the 2 family, the townhouse has to meet certain design standards as well. So a lot of times, and I spent a lot of time looking at a lot of the 2 families in the areas we're talking about. Some of them aren't overly attractive. I mean, that's just, some of them just got built where they just put a box up with 2 entries and here's our 2 family. The townhouse has better design standards, so they have to comply with the form-based aspect of that. I'm sorry, I held you off.
Yes, can you describe what the format of the meeting is gonna be? I don't mean to calm anybody down that wants to ask a question. Are we gonna have a presentation followed by question and answers, or are we gonna have it intermixed?
I'm fine either way, whatever you want to do.
Something? All right, then I've got some questions.
Certainly.
So let me just tell you my background. So I've lived in Norwalk for 70 years. When I first moved to Norwalk, there was a dairy farm next door to where we lived in North Norwalk. So I'm familiar with the AAA and the A residents. Then you say that by combining some of them, it's not, you're gonna measure the width, but there's certainly a big impact and difference. If I have a house and I can't see my neighbor, like the well-known White Barn Theater property when the Schweitzers owned it and lived there. And you rezone that, it's gonna have a distinct impact, because now you're gonna see houses that are
Why would
closer
you,
to you, as that's divided up into smaller pieces. So the observation you made, that by just measuring the width of the property, it may be, 200 feet wide in the front, and it may be, 800 feet wide in the back. And yet that can be chipped away possibly.
but so just maybe I didn't explain it clearly, but right now the width in the AAA zone, you have to, there's a width requirement in the existing zoning now. You have to have, it's 40,000 square feet plus 150 foot wide on the street. So that's like if my corner of my property here, my corner property here, it's 150 feet between. That number doesn't change in the new zoning.
Right, but it may be vastly in excess of that at the present time, it could be subdivided.
Right, and you could subdivide now if it's vastly larger.
Well, not if you've taken the screen down, but you had something up that indicated that you were combining the AAA with some B zones.
Right, but it's the same, but if somebody's in for example, somebody's in the AA zone now and we put them into the new CD3L, the largest lot zone, which would be the equivalent of the AAA zone. They would have the same standard as that AAA zone and they'd be on a smaller lot, so you wouldn't see more.
Those are the lucky bees as opposed to the unlucky bees.
Apparently so. All right, another general observation. I'm sure we'll get to more things. So you described that there's two versions of trying to describe zoning. But since Norwalk, at least for my 70 years of zoning, I've used A, AAA, B, Z, C, and so on. We all know those. Why do we have to change the nomenclature that we're all familiar with?
Well, it's a brand new zoning code and like anything else that's new,
Well, that's a piece of paper, but you're not getting a new set of residents. Why not stick with the nomenclature that everybody's familiar with?
because we're not going by that format anymore. The AAA
Why?
double, because we're using a different format now. It's
Why?
Yeah.
because it's one of the recommendations within the P O C D to modernize and update the zoning regulations. And we feel this approach is the best
Is
approach.
Newton doing it? Is Stanford doing it? Is Westport doing it? Is Darien or New Canaan doing it? Or is this just uniquely Norwalk? Like Route 7, we're the only ones that get that. We're the only ones that do regionalization for our schools. I mean, are we just the guinea pig for what the state wants to do? I mean, is there anyone else doing what we're doing here in Norwalk?
Updating our zoning code? Yes.
Anything to this extreme?
Yeah, Hartford's done it, Bridgeport's done it, Stanford's redone theirs. I don't, well, see, as despite what you may say or think, our decisions and our recommendations are not guided by what Hartford says to do. We make our decisions what we feel is best in Norwalk. If that's the narrative you want to go with, that's fine, but that's not correct.
It seems like you want the nomenclature and the document to be easier for you rather than better for the community.
But it will be better for the community over time. So it's like anything else that's new. It's different. So different is scary, but
You can finish. I gotta, can we let him finish?
Well, that's why I asked.
Sure, but you're asking, but we need to let him finish. And
I'll
so
be
we
glad
have-
to let him. I'll be glad to do it either way.
I think we have to manage this because we gotta get out of here by 8 o'clock. So I think if we move this on a little bit, that might be most helpful.
I don't
If you have a question, yes, you can ask that.
Just briefly.
And you can go back to.
No, but it's up to the moderator to moderate.
Maybe we just do a quick overview where you and your staff see the benefits. It's like what drove you to get here versus, this is a lot of technical detail, which is important, but, maybe the background and the research of, not just POCD, but what's the driving force and what do you see the benefits to?
sure. So I kind of hit on some of that at the beginning. The existing code itself is not very functional, not very user-friendly, not well put together, and has many flaws in it in terms of how it functions from one piece of the regulations to another. As I mentioned, we updated the citywide plan in 2019. So as a good practice, that document has a set of recommendations on future land use. So it's good to align your zoning with that document. So that's another principle we followed. And I think just from if the zoning regulations weren't structurally deficient now, there would be a reason to do it without doing that. The fact that they are structurally deficient now is reason enough to look at the code. So I think I'm going to hold off on any other questions. Then let me get through and then I'm happy to sit and argue and debate till everyone's blue in the face. So, but that's kind of there. I think there's a lot of reasons. A, that the existing document's deeply flawed, and B, it needs updating. We haven't updated our code in over 30 years. Think about what's happened in your life in the last 4 years and the dramatic changes we've seen and the shifts we've seen with how we live and where we live. So those are just other reasons. So here's another point to simplification. The image on the left is what the new code would look like versus the image on the right, which is the existing zoning. So this kind of purple color in the middle is the zone we're in now. And it's kind of where the city envisions the urban core of the city. And that kind of runs from Wall Street all the way down to South Norwalk, where the zoning was redone in, I think 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. So it's just kind of a simplification, unification. So for example, the image on the right, kind of where I'm pointing, there's about 6 zones within a quarter-mile distance of each other. And they all are very similar, but then kind of, don't necessarily align well with each other. So it's just a good point to like simplify and consolidate. Some other things that were achieved through this. Right now, the Route 1 corridor, which is, Westport Ave, Connecticut Ave, there's 2 different zones. There's a business number 1 and a business number 2. There's no reason to have a business number 1 and business number 2 when they both did the same thing. So we've consolidated those zones. One thing I think will be a nice change over time is the Route 1 corridor won't look like the Route 1 corridor. A common, complaint that I have is when you get to the Westport line or you get to the Darien line, Route 1 looks vastly different. And that's just, the reason that is because that's the way they regulate it versus the way we regulate it. So over time, the new regulations won't allow a sea of asphalt at the front. They'll have all the parking will be to the side of the rear. There'll be more landscape standards, more unified building design, and more unified signage. So the street itself will start to look more aesthetically pleasing. And we're also thinking about some ways to add kind of nodes of activity at certain intersections to improve walkability and make it a more friendly overall place. Another change really quickly is the smaller multifamily zone was combined with the neighborhood business zone. There were kind of 2 zones that duplicated themselves a little bit, but didn't have great function. There's also a new zone called the civic zone, and that's meant to capture all municipally owned property. That includes the state of Connecticut, city of Norwalk, and the taxing districts. And what that hopes to achieve is provide a little more flexibility for the city on city projects, while also protecting neighbors in some of the more like AAA zone outlying areas where you have schools and churches and those kind of things. Last one you might see on the map is there was work done for a waterfront study. There's a few things we're still working on with Common Council, which we hope to work out in the next couple of months. And those changes will get incorporated into this document. Some other big picture items are for height, we're no longer regulating height in terms of a maximum number. We'll just regulate the stories. And within those stories, there's a defined height from ceiling to ceiling so that the overall maximum height won't be any larger really from what you perceive. We no longer regulate FAR, which basically is a measurement of kind of the building mass on a property, because really what controls the building is how tall you let it be, how much of the surface you let it occupy in the parking. Those are the things that really regulate the property. We also changing from what's called building coverage, which is kind of like the footprint of the building, where we're now regulating impervious surface, which is all the hardscape plus the building. And the reason behind that is to regulate and improve water quality. So it's just a different measure. We have new standards for lighting. We get complaints about lighting, but right now we don't really have any standards on what should be regulated and why. So we have standards for that. There's a large shift in terms of what we're looking at for sustainability, and that's an ongoing conversation with the city council as well as with the Planning and Zoning Commission to increase sustainability measures. We're revising the flood regs again to right now, Norwalk's regulations are pretty tight, so we're trying to loosen them up a little bit while maintaining kind of the purpose and intent of that regulation. And we've also put in some measures for increased public notification for distance requirements, because right now we only require you notify the immediate abutters. So we're putting in a larger distance as well as putting up signage for certain types of activities, so people are a little more aware of what's going on. Last one on this page, for single family zones where this, and it happens a lot, I guess, in row 8 and as well, where there are concerns about grading and drainage on the neighbor's property. So somebody knocks a house down, the house was probably built in the 50s or 60s. They ramp up the property and then grade it up. So that usually leads to runoff problems. So we put in standards now to deal with that, which we think will alleviate some of those problems. For this area, for the most part, South Norwalk didn't see a lot of change. I don't think there's, big comprehensive changes overall. One proposal is to bump up the stories allowed from 6 to 8. And I know that's kind of in line with what's happening up on West Ave. Something if people are concerned about, we could talk about. No increase in the density at all. So we haven't changed that metric at all. And there are a few areas in South Norwalk that we've actually pulled back the existing zoning to make it a little less intense. And the reason behind that was, and I can show you on the map, was to protect some of those more historic neighborhoods. We didn't want those older homes to flip and get torn down. So that's, a possibility with any time you have more allowed density. So we've pulled that back a little bit. I'll show you on the map in just a little bit. No changes from the industrial zones that were passed last year. So there's no change to that. We talked about Shorefront Park a little bit in the change to allow from single family to 1 or 2 family. Our position is it's not going to have any impact on the area. If someone chooses to knock a house down, they can, as of right today, they can build a new house. They can build a luxury home. No, they can, we can't. They're not. Yeah. Yeah, we can get back to that. So here's the map, just kind of big picture. I showed you South Norwalk a little bit forward. We're kind of like right about where the green spot is. That's that civic zone. A big chunk of South Norwalk is a CD5, which is the urban core. I'm right, I don't know if my cursor's showing. See that, right? We're right here. So the CD4, which is this area over here, that's a multifamily zone, but it's a lower scale multifamily zone than what's here. That goes up to 3.5 stories and is less dense. The kind of model we followed around our infrastructure, our transit, and our job centers was within a 1/4 mile. We wanted to be, as you fan out from that, within a 1/4 mile, we wanted to be a little less dense. And then another 1/4 mile from that, we wanted to be even a little less dense, which is that 2-family zone. And then when you get past that 1/2 mile point of view, then you start to really focus in more on single family zoning. That's not 100% of the case everywhere, but that's kind of the model we tried to follow. It doesn't always work out because Norwalk is not a circle. Norwalk is more like a cross where we follow the major highways and the major road networks. When you get to the southern piece of this, and I'll work my way back up, when you get to the southern piece of this, there really weren't many changes with the single family zones. I mentioned the industrial zones that were redone last year. There's no changes there. This area through here, which is Baxter, Neptune, and some areas through here, no change. Right now, that's existing 1 or 2 families, so there's no change there. And the one area we talked about quite a bit was Shorefront Park, which we think makes sense to put it into the 1 or 2 family zone. Yeah, that's up past, that's Flax Hill, that's Golden Hill in those areas. That's where the CD4 boundary kind of stretches. A lot of that is in that zone now, but we pushed everything a little bit further to the west. What we're trying to do is get the zones right, and where the lines on the map eventually end up, it can be adjusted. And then over time, if the city needs to grow, then those lines can be expanded. That's kind of the idea, is if it can be flexible over time. Yeah.
I just want to read a statement from Shorefront.
Can we do that after, if you don't mind? I know we're going to have a lot of Shorefront. I'd prefer to do it after. though, if you don't mind. And I'm done, so we're happy to jump right in. So just give you a little bit of idea about next steps. So right now, we're kind of in the, public outreach, public meeting phase with different neighborhood groups. One of my coworkers is at the West Norwalk Neighborhood Association tonight doing the same thing. Tomorrow night is the District C meeting at City Hall. Next week, there are 2 meetings. And I think we're working with like Bike Walk Commission as well. So we'll be having meetings with those groups, Zoning Board of Appeals, the Harbor Management Commission. So all these different groups we're going to go out and meet with, and anybody else that wants to meet, we're happy to meet with. Can't say every one of those meetings will be an evening meeting, but we're happy to do Zoom calls, conversations, and emails. And before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to show you the website, which might answer some of your questions you have. So I'm just going to switch the share and pull up the website. Yeah, we can decide if we want to go one-on-one with in-person versus virtual. So if you navigate to the city's webpage, under the Planning and Zoning Department, there's this tab here is the second one on the left. It's the zoning regulations update, and it takes you to this page right here. And it's kind of a landing page where it walks you through, a little bit of overview of why we're doing this, which were some of the conversation we had tonight. As you scroll down, there's a series of information sheets, and some of this we covered. What is form-based code and why are we doing it? The second one is kind of a breakdown about the changes and how the changes equate in terms of the building height and the building setbacks and what all this means. There's explanation about the zoning map changes. And so hopefully some of this will be answered there, but I know, you're probably zooming in on some very specific areas. The outreach schedule, which is updated, I think as of today, is there as well. And then there's a series of information sheets about some other specific things, changes to the flood zone regs, changes to the CAM regulations, what we're doing in terms of sustainability, and also what I mentioned about grading and drainage and what those changes are. And, sorry about that. And down below that is, so how do you kind of contact us or make outreach? So we've got several avenues. Like I mentioned, we're doing these meetings here. You can email myself or Brian Baker, and our contact information is on this page. We've also got this feedback form here. So you click on that. It asks some basic questions about who you are and provides the ability to provide comment. And so what we're doing with that comment is we're going to tabulate those comments. As of last week, we had over 30. So that eventually we haven't gotten there yet. It's going to take us a couple of weeks to catch up. All the comments are going to get downloaded into like a spreadsheet. As those comments are written, we're not going to edit anybody's comments. Staff will have a staff reply to each one of those comments. And then from there, the Planning and Zoning Commission will have to look at those comments and the staff recommendation, and then make a decision on what they feel is best in terms of changes or no changes. So that's all available. And the last thing I want to show you before I turn it back over to you, again, here's this link on the bottom right is the complete draft. It's a big document and it's heavy. So if you wanted to, you could also look at each one of the different articles. The one is the general is the first one. Article 4 is the one with probably the most to it. It's all the different zones and what they mean and all the standards related to that zone. There's also the definitions, which is very handy. And there's, broken down by signs as well. At the last thing I'm going to talk about is the zoning map. So the one on the left is a static zoning map. It's just a PDF. So you click on that and up pops a PDF of the map. You can zoom in on it. The one on the right, I think, is more useful for somebody. If somebody wants to give me an address, and I can show you what it does. Anybody have an address they want to volunteer?
116 Shorefront Park.
116 Shorefront. So one thing to point out is this database it's pulling from is a national database. So if you punch in your address, make sure it says Norwalk after it, because you could end up in California. It's very possible. Luckily, this is the only Shorefront Park that is in the database is Norwalk. So it zooms in on the property and you have to actually click on the property. So you go right next to it. And so what you see here, and it's for some reason, it's not consistent between the existing and the proposed zoning, but what it shows is this one pops up the existing zoning. So it says you're in the B residence zone. And there's a link. I'm not going to click on all the links. That's the existing regulations for your zone, as well as the existing schedule and height. So the schedule and height is how tall the building can be, how much of the lot you can occupy, all the setbacks. Up here, there's a little arrow. So you click on that. That tells you what the proposed zone is for that one property. Then you can click on this link. I'll do that for you. This will take you right to that zone. We broke out the sheets within that. So if you're in the CD3 zone, here's the CD3 sheet. You scroll down as I went through before, and then it starts to tell you, what can I do on my property and why? Close that out. And then it also has a link to the use table, which is what we went through a little earlier. And this is where I can zoom in to kind of promise what I told you I would do. This is that same, is that big enough? Can you guys see that?
Yeah, you're gonna define community residence.
Yeah, I'll jump out. I have to go into the definitions, but I'll do that. So as I was saying before, here's all the zones at the top. So it's all the zones in the city, and it's just all the uses that are allowed, and they're broken down by type. So the industrial uses are grouped together, the residential uses are grouped together, commercial uses are grouped together, like retail, office, whatever. And then it tells you whether it's permitted in the zone, not permitted in the zone, or permitted by special permit. Let me go back and answer that last question before we turn it over to more questions. Oops, sorry, that was not my goal. So one thing we're going to do after we're done with the document is we're going to regroup the definitions because they did them strict alphabetical order, and I don't think it's the best approach because sometimes there's like dwelling multifamily, dwelling two family, and they might not be next to each other. So we think it might make sense to have it grouped a little differently, but we'll get there after we get through the adoption phase. I'm sorry, and what was the definition again? I'm sorry.
A community residence versus congregate living.
And so one nice feature with this, as I mentioned, there's definitions for everything, which is really good. And there's also page numbers. And you say, why is that good? Because our existing regulations don't have page numbers. And you said
Community residence.
There we go. Let me blow it up. Hold on one sec.
So I see it there. A facility which houses 8 or fewer mentally ill adults and the staff of such facility, which is like, so that would then be permitted in Sherwood Park.
That's
But-
permitted today, and that's a state law.
Well, I
so.
know congregate living is different because it's ADA protected.
Yeah,
I'm
these,
not really sure how this got broken out as being separate from congregate living.
let's go see. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy with this.
No, but they're supposed to be covered by the same federal protections.
No, so congregate's more on the assisted living side. So that's somebody that's, needs care, whereas the other one's like a group home, which are pretty common in a lot of areas. There was one up on Newtown Ave. I think it's since closed, but it's a place where if someone needs assistance, but not 100% assistance, and they kind of,
But it's not a halfway house.
no.
Confusing.
No, I don't know if, I'm not sure if halfway house is defined or not, but it's not that. No, that's a different category. All right, I'm going to stop sharing.
So Steve, just continue. The question I was just asked. So in that area, there was. Are they still there? What was-
Oh, should we, hold on one sec. So if people are watching at home, they're probably not going to be able to hear you unless you're at the microphone, would be my guess. So it'd probably be easier if and I don't know if we want to do we have anybody raising their hand if they want to speak? We have one. Yeah. If you click,
There's 2 hands.
yeah, we have 2 people. So
Gail.
there's 2 with raised hands on Zoom. Might be easier. Let's let them go first, and then we have an hour, so I think we have plenty of time to get into stuff. So it might be easier to let them go, and then I'm happy to chat, but if anybody just go to the microphone, because otherwise I don't think they'll be able to hear what you're asking.
So I promoted her panelist.
Okay, is that Sonia?
Yeah.
Okay. Sonia, if you can, I think you're allowed to speak now, so. Sonia, you're with us?
Yeah, I'm here. It made me, it changed my, when you gave me the ability to join as a panelist, it kind of recycled my.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, you're, feel free to jump in.
We've been having meetings for quite some time, going back to when all of this development first started going on down here in South Norwalk. And one of the things that we've been saying here at the District B meetings for quite some time is that we were concerned about the heights of the buildings that were being allowed. And, and we've been saying that no one's paying attention, no one's listening. And now you just said to us that the proposed change is to go from 6 stories to 8 stories. I mean, why change that and go higher when we've been saying we don't want them as high as they are now?
Yeah, and the only real reason for that was because the existing regulations with different amenities and with other, with parking related things, you can already go to that standard. So we just try to make it consistent. It's not something, if that was something people wanted to reverse, and I don't think it impacts anything else that happens in the zone.
I think it is going to impact it because now if they can go higher, they're going to go higher.
But what I'm saying, if we put it back to 6, it wouldn't impact anything else proposed in the zone. So that's not something, that's something we have to have, I don't
So I
think.
think she's proposing that we go to 6.
No, right. No, I got-
Exactly, because if you say that they can go, okay, you're proposing right now, you're saying that the highest they can go is 6. Quite frankly, I would like to see it reduced to 4, even 3. But if that's not going to be the case, at least leave it at 6. Don't change it to 8. Now the buildings are going to get higher. Just because there's nothing proposed right now that is higher than that doesn't mean that something is not going to get proposed.
Okay, no, we hear
Going
you.
to then take advantage of the fact that they can go up to 8 stories.
Okay.
Yes.
Steve, to her point, and I think she is correct. So I think that she is correct. But my question would be, if we change it to 6, is there any loophole that allows it to go to 8 or higher? Who, and what?
Special permit.
Right, exactly. So is
No,
there a
it-
mechanism
th-
that can change that? Because if we say 6 and there's something in there that they can say, well, we've got an exception to this and we want to go to 7 or 8.
So the existing regulations have some allowances in there for parking structures to go higher and for hotels to go at least 8, maybe even 10. I don't remember. The hotel on South Main, I know that. Yeah. So that was put in a while ago. That's not a new change. It's been on the books for a long time.
That's a concern.
Yeah.
We'll go one more from that.
Yeah, we have one more here and then we'll go there.
All right, so we'll promote Gail, panelist. No, she has one.
Gail, is that what it is?
Yes.
Okay, Gail, you're available. She over? I don't see her.
Set to unmute her mic.
Gail, you just need to unmute and then you're good. Okay, go ahead, Gail.
All right, so we'll just take someone else. into-
Yeah, just mute her for a second.
Yeah.
All right, if you could, I don't really care what order, you guys can figure that out, but just make sure, if you can go to the microphone, just, if it's high, just drop down the stand a little bit, but no, it's having some audio.
Lisa Britton, I'm in Shorefront Park. first I want to say I appreciate what you guys are trying to do to clean up the zoning. I mean, it is chaotic. You need a PhD and what have you. So I understand simplifying things. But there are two significant changes that I see, and it's anybody who's in a B zone that's been a single family turned into two family, as well as the height. I agree completely with Sonia. Going to 8 is absolutely absurd. But I'll tell you, in the B zones, which has been kind of done in various places, parts of Rowayton, parts down East Avenue, Shorefront Park, the B zones are where they've been single family residences are also reasonably smaller properties. And so you're now suddenly saying they can be two property. I have a concern that this is not necessarily going to be two properties that somebody goes and buys and it's a duplex. It's going to become rentals. And so you're dramatically changing single family neighborhoods and turning them into rental properties. Before you accuse me of being a NIMBY, I grew up out west where there's a much more egalitarian zoning. I had duplexes across the street from the house that I grew up in. In the state of Connecticut, which is the most racist, bipolar zoning. And that's why I asked you, where else is this zoning going on? You say Norwalk's doing it. You say Bridgeport's doing it. Is it being done in any of our surrounding communities? Is it in the towns? Is it being done in New Haven? And so you've already got streets there because we don't enforce anything. We don't, my two questions I have, if you go from single family to two family, where's the parking? Are they supposed to be able to park on the premises or does that move to the street? Because we don't look at any of the two family, any of the zoning that's been allowed to go to two family to four family to six family. There's cars everywhere. We enforce nothing. And when you talked about the form where there's some restrictions, we don't have any architectural review boards. So like I said, in a neighborhood like Shorefront Park, which is 95% owner occupied, single family, has been for 100 years. That's a significant change because Sandy changed a lot of the waterfront. Like I said, a lot of those houses got destroyed, but we've also got a lot of older single family homes owned by older people that completely could change the makeup of a single family home. So I'm curious about the design restrictions and height and things of that sort. So that's not just for Shorefront Park. That is also happening in parts of Rowayton. It's happening along East Avenue. There seem to be some arbitrary lines of which neighborhoods that were B are now going to be two family in which we're allowed to stay single family right along East Avenue. Seems to be corresponding to some of our council people.
So I think I stated this, but I'll restate it. It's important to note. So if you have a single family house now, you're required to provide 2 parking spaces, right? That's the rule. Not everybody's got 2 legal parking spaces. Norwalks they have a standard which everybody hates about not parking in the front setback, which draws a lot of violations and complaints from people because a lot of these older homes were built in the 50s and 60s, and maybe they had 1 car at the time. Now there's at least 2 cars. If you had the kids at home, it's 3 or 4 cars. And so where do they park? They overflow on the property and on the street. If you do an ADU, you have to add 1 additional space. That's the rule that came in with the passing of that last year. If you build a new 2-family, you have to provide 4 compliant parking spaces, and those have to be per the code to the side or the rear. They can't be in the front. So I can't say that they won't have 4 cars in each house and they're going to have to figure out where to park. That's a different discussion, but the zoning code would require the parking itself to be compliant.
On their
Right.
property, not on the street.
Correct. Right.
But they can't force people to park on the property. They can force you to have the spaces, but you can't force people to actually.
Right. There are times where, and the city's looking at this, one of the areas where we want to see it enacted first, I have to lobby a little more for is in East Norwalk, like 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, very tight streets, the lots. And I think there's some overflow parking from other things going on there that aren't related to who lives there. So there would be a residential parking pass program where you have to, if you're going to park on the street, you're supposed to live there, not supposed to be, going to the train station and walking or something like that. It's not the intent of those streets. That's, a model that the TMP folks in the city have to put together, but that's a program I think could solve some of these problems, but maybe not all.
Who's going to enforce this?
That would be through the parking authority.
What about-
I think, but
You talked
don't,
about-
let me.
You
back
also
to that.
talked about there'd be more design regulate, there would be some more design, they can't just build a box.
Right.
So how is that? We don't have an architectural review board here in Norwalk, so.
So that's one of the things with the form-based code. The form-based code kind of late, I'll try, if I get a second, I'll try to pull up what the townhouse looks like to show you. But that's kind of one of the purposes of the form-based code. It kind of says, this is the building you can build here. If you're going to build a two-family, it's got to look like this. We don't say it's got to be, white and red, that level of detail, but it defines the massing, and it has like a top, a middle, and a base, middle and a top, and it kind of lays out what that is, lays out the front of the building, what it can look like, what type of porch, landscaping features, fencing, where in a single family house, we don't regulate that. And I know we don't have the personnel to do that or the desire to do that. In a single family house, it's just not our purpose, I don't think. But on the two family, which would be new, we would regulate that. And now, once we get through the extra, get a few other people, once we're go through Tanner, then maybe I'll jump back to the people online, and then I'll pull up the to show you.
Urban Mulvihill. So I just, as a point of background, I was on the zoning board of appeals for 12 years. I was the chairman for 8 years. I haven't served in probably the last 12 years, but I'm pretty familiar with zoning regulations for those 12 years of activity. So I've got an initial question about the procedure we're following in general. I wrote you an email, short email. I don't know if you read it or saw it, but when I learned that this was all going on, what I read was that there were 2 meetings in early April. I have yet to find very many people in Norwalk that know that this is going on even now. I haven't found a single person out of the maybe 150 or 200 people that attend the South Norwalk Boat Club meetings on Monday nights. Nobody knows what's going on. At the mayor's ball, I found 3 people that knew that this was going on, and they're the most politically astute people, and I was with some of them. This kind of a meeting that we're having, I don't think is well publicized. Now, you indicated as an example that if someone with their own individual property wants to do something that's not permitted by zoning, you have to give notice to the adjoining property owners and so on. I don't think proper notice has occurred, not that there's a standard for it, but I'm sure the city of Norwalk has email addresses for many of the residents. They should have been emailed that we're changing the zoning throughout the entire city. And so I'll ask you a simple question. I hope it's got a good answer. We're having this meeting. We've had similar meetings when we're talking about the general zoning or use regulations. I've forgotten the technical name for the process that went on 5 or 6 years ago. How are we capturing, since this is a two-way street, I hope, what people are saying tonight? How are you capturing that?
So I'll touch on both questions. So we were actually talking about today. So just time frame wise, if it wasn't clear with the slide, the actual end date for adoption, we're thinking is like end of September. Okay, so we're April or May. So we're 5-6 months away from that point. We're doing these meetings now. We did one last week, excuse me. This is just 2 going on tonight. We have probably half a dozen similar to these, plus another 3 or 4 with different city boards and agencies set up. So that's part of our outreach. And we're reaching out to neighborhood organizations, whomever wants to chat, we'll chat. Like I said, not every one of them is going to be an evening meeting, but we're happy to do that during the day, Zoom question and answer. But if people are submitting emails or filling out that online form I mentioned, all of those are going to get put into one spreadsheet with the comments or question as submitted. Staff is going to add a column where we provide a response to that from the technical standpoint. And then that will all we're going to put that all up on the website. It's not going to happen probably for a few weeks. By the time we get caught up with everything else, it's just not going to be right then and there. And then that's all going to go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, who has to look at it and say, all right, this makes sense. We don't agree, or yes, we agree. And then that change will ultimately get incorporated into the final document. You said something about April with hearings. We're looking at June 21st, and I have to get confirmation with the commissions because it hasn't been finalized. June 21st and June 28th for public hearings. Those are not adoption hearings. Those are just like tonight, where you can get up and say, this stinks, I hate this, why are you doing it? scrap it, whole thing. You can say whatever you want. We're going to do it 2 different nights. Those will be the only items on the agenda. So we'll have 3 or 4 hours at each night for the public to comment. We will collate all those comments. If they're repeat comments to what we've already heard, they're already been answered, or we'll provide responses at a later date. I don't see city staff responding at those meetings. I think we're just going to listen. And then ultimately, the Planning and Zoning Commission has to decide what they want to incorporate and what they don't want to incorporate.
So let me repeat my question.
forgot your other
As to tonight. How are you capturing this input right now, tonight, here, the other locations in Norwalk that is going on? Are you recording what
This
people
is
are
being
saying?
recorded right now.
It is.
Yeah.
And are those recordings going to be sent on to planning and zoning members?
I'm assuming this goes to Zoom. So it goes to on the city's YouTube page. So the commission can be, if they wish to go back and watch any of these, they're more than welcome to.
What do you mean if they wish to?
I can't make them.
Well, you're making us, giving us assurances.
Giving us feedback. So
But
we're,
if it's not going anywhere, what's the purpose?
we're getting the feedback. We're tabulating all the comments, everything.
Written comments. I'm talking about the verbal comments when
so-
you get the emotion and if you're Ernest Hemingway, you can write a comment and maybe it persuades people. But if they hear people speak and you hear the passion and concern in their voice, it's also very effective.
Yes, so the videos of all the meetings will be to the commissioners. They have the option to watch or not. We will take the comments received. So everything you're talking about, what Shorefront Park does not want to go to the new 2-family zone. Got it. That'll get incorporated into the spreadsheet with all the other comments.
Okay, I'm just going to say a couple of the short
Oh,
things.
can I answer one other thing before? You asked another question that I didn't answer.
No, that was the question.
There
How are
was
you
another one.
capturing it tight?
We did for notice. So going back to that. So what we were talking about today are a couple different things. So we understand that not everybody's clued in what's going on with city.
Almost no one. would be a
So
better
what we're going to
description.
do is work. I haven't quite got their blessing yet, hopefully through the tax collector's office, when they send their notice out, we're going to hopefully piggyback that with piece of information, which I think goes out. I don't remember. She told me they're working on it, has to make a decision by the end of May. So there'll be something that goes out to tell people that what the process is, how you can be involved, what the impacts are. So that will be all sent with that as well.
Okay, just one other quick observation. Probably the most important aspect of zoning regulations is to ensure that where you've invested your life savings and a lot of money will be preserved the way it was when you purchased it. The idea of combining the B and C zones, even with the fancy new names, strikes me as hugely inappropriate with the principal objective of zoning, which is to preserve the property values that people have bought into.
I don't know if that's the principal purpose of zoning, but
Well,
okay, we can work
And,
off
and,
that.
and I'll put it in this context. Sitting on the ZBA, one of the things that got the most criticism was when someone with a non-conforming use wanted to expand it, even the slightest way. What you're doing is tantamount to that with a zone change of combining B and C and making all of it suddenly across the board non-conforming to the degree that everything that was restricted to single-family ownership or single-family occupancy, or single-family ownership probably is more accurate, to two-family, which traditionally is got no owner occupancy. I walk to the train station every day. I live on Quintard Avenue and Shorefront Park, double barrel. So I walk from the B residence to the train station. I've done that for 54 years. As I walk in that direction, I go from the B zone to the C zone. It gets seedier and seedier until you get what you get, which is cars parked in the front lawn with,
But the majority
architecture
of those
that's
C zone are already
unattractive.
single family though.
huh?
The majority of those are single family. in the
Not,
C zone.
not as you go toward the train station, they're not. They're
There's a
two
big
family
chunk
houses right
on-
across the street, right down the street on Quintard Avenue is two family.
Right, but then like south of Shorefront Park, where Baxter and Neptune, most of that.
No, I'm talking about walking toward the train station. I'm sure you know where the South Norwalk train station is.
Yes, I do.
And when I go down Concord, for example, that's two family. It's terrible. Nobody living there owns it. Nobody keeps up their properties, has none of the characteristics that are important that you see in a B zone. So turning that or I agree with you that it's probably unlikely that much is going to change because everything is built up already. But why make it permissible under zoning to do it? B zones are valuable zones. Once you get away from the AAA and A zones, I don't know, you're going to know the figure off the top of your head, but I'll bet the B zones are probably 50% of the population of the city of Norwalk. So anyway, it's a big, big change. And I don't think it should occur.
Okay,
All
understood.
right, so, and everybody here could probably go on for hours about this.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tanner Thompson. I live at 16 Hillside Place, which is just up the hill here. I walked here. I'm in District B. I'm also the chair of the city's Bike Walk Commission. And I have a couple of comments. One, I want to give strictly in my role as a resident. And then the next one has to do specifically with biking and walking. And so that one I'll be speaking at least to some extent in my role as the Bike Walk Commissioner. But first, the personal comment. I want to talk about what the purpose of zoning is. When zoning was first established here in the United States, it was very explicitly to keep poor people out of the suburbs. And at the time, poor people meant explicitly Black people. Like that was the purpose of zoning from day one. And it's evolved a little bit as our conception of who undesirable people are, or at least some people's perception of who undesirable people are, has changed and evolved. It might be very revealing for some of you to learn that at one point we had rules in Norwalk about where the Italians could live. And East Norwalk, like 1st through 5th Street, was advertised as a place where Italians couldn't live, and thus it was desirable. And zoning continues to work that way today, but a lot more subtly. So what we've got now is a city where in most of the land area of Norwalk, you can only build a single family home, and thus you can only live there if you make a certain amount of money. And that amount of money keeps climbing, climbing, and climbing as housing prices go up. Why do housing prices go up? They go up because of supply and demand. The demand keeps going up to live in a place like Norwalk because it's an excellent place to live. I moved here and I stayed here because it's a great place to live and I like it here. And a lot of people think the same way and they want to live here because it's a great place to live. But we are not building enough housing to accommodate those people. And so if you look at simple supply and demand, Econ 101, the price goes up. The price keeps going up because we don't provide places to live for the people who want to live here. And so what happens is that the people who can least afford to live here, maybe who grew up here, maybe who grew up in South Norwalk in the projects, have to move because they can't afford to live here anymore because we are not building as many houses as the people who want to live here. And thus only the people who can afford to live here the most get to live here and other people have to move out. I'm very fortunate to be able to live here and I was able to buy into the housing market before the pandemic happened, before the housing prices went up. But I'm kind of an anomaly in that case because most of my friends can't afford to buy into the housing market. So that's why this is a little bit personal for me. And that's why when people say the idea behind zoning is that we preserve what we bought into 20 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever, as the same, I'm sure Shorefront Park is beautiful. I've ridden my bike through there. I know it's beautiful, in fact. But the thing is, if you ensure that that doesn't change, what you ensure is that that becomes more and more and more exclusive and that the bar to living there goes up and up and up and up. And that means that people who lived here for their whole lives who can't afford to live here anymore have to move out. And you only get the more wealthy people who can afford to stay. So that's.
I just want to piggyback on your comment though.
Oh, absolutely. Oh.
Look at this room, this is a very diverse community. I hear what you're saying, but the reality is that this state's the problem. It's not Norwalk. Norwalk's a very diverse.
Absolutely.
city.
Why don't you make?
Well,
that-
let's keep the, so
Yeah.
one of the things, and I probably should have mentioned is a good segue is one of the things we tried to do with the regulations, we didn't seek like a massive increase we needed to have density. That wasn't like our goal. One of the things we tried to do is provide housing opportunity, which we think the 2-family does, which is consistent with what the POCD says, provide some different housing options like missing middle housing, which is like that 2 to 10 unit development. So we tried to loosen up those boundaries a little bit without doing changes that weren't consistent with the plan and going out with the areas where there wasn't the infrastructure to support additional housing. So somebody who's out in the AAA zone, are they going to be able to get a bus? How are they going to get to the train station from there? So that's kind of part of the overall philosophy.
Yeah, and I applaud that because I'm going to switch into my bike walk commission chair hat right now. Because in order to make more people, to allow more people to live in a place where they can walk and bike as part of their daily life, it makes sense to make sure that the housing exists in places where that is most conducive. And right now that means our urban cores, and that means next to train stations. So that makes a lot of sense to me. My question specifically about walk and bikeability is corner stores. So basically the idea is that if the extent to which you can walk and bike to stuff is almost exactly the same as the extent to which places exist within walking and biking distance of your house. And so I noticed, for example, I live in CD4, what is currently the D zone, what is mostly being renamed CD4. And it looks like there's a lot of potential there for small retail like corner stores and even maybe restaurants. But even I, having spent a couple hours looking at the regulations, I wasn't sure exactly what category they would fall under. And what dynamics exist in the new regulations that would shape where corner stores could go?
So that the CD4 zone, again, as I mentioned, and this is getting into a little bit of the weeds, but that's a combination of the current D zone, which is a multifamily, the less dense multifamily, and the neighborhood business, which is kind of a catch-all commercial, residential, but also allows lesser dense multifamily. The new CD4 zone, which combines the two, does allow for a limited amount of commercial in there, which is meant to get at the mom and pop stores, corner stores, small restaurants, small service industry. You could have a small gym, you could have a deli, but it would allow those in those zones. So that is permitted.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. We have two more here, and then I want to jump back. There's 3 people online. So are you, Donna, you waiting or no? Okay, so we'll do 2 and then we'll jump to the other 3, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Diane Highland. I live at 61 Devil's Garden Road. Something you haven't talked about, you talked about parking, which is totally an issue. My entire street is 1-car garages. So everybody has at least 1 car, if not 2 outside. So maybe the dimensions that you've outlined will prohibit the ability to build 2-family homes just because of the square footage. I don't know, but I can't even imagine a 2-family house on my street. The other thing you haven't addressed, though, is traffic in general. If you go out on the Post Road or Westport Ave, it's brutal. And now you're going to bring in a lot more people that are going to be using those. And what is the infrastructure going to be doing to support that?
Sure. So for the Route 1 corridor, for example, we haven't really changed too much in those areas. And the kind of changes we've put in here. So if you follow some of the things that the city's done over the last few years, we rezoned a big chunk of South Norwalk. We rezoned West Avenue, Wall Street. The last big rezone was up at Merritt 7. And that was pretty much the entire west side of Glover Avenue. That's a wholesale change where we completely rezoned what you could do there in terms of the height, the density, and so forth. So we went into super detailed information about all the impacts of, infrastructure impacts related to that. The type of change that we're talking about over here, very incremental change. So even if we changed all the B zone to 2-family tomorrow, not everybody's just going to go knock their house down and build a 2-family house and you're doubling the amount of cars in the street. It's not going to work that way. It doesn't happen. Some of the other changes we've instituted, you just haven't seen the change. The type of change, like for Shorefront Park, for example, we think it's going to be what the market's going to dictate for that. What's been rebuilt in those areas if there's been a tear down, it's been a big, brand new home that's very expensive. But when the trend, and if the market indicates that's the highest and best use for that property, that's what's going to get built there. So it's not going to lead to this massive street by street tear down and building of 2-family houses. Because where we have the 2-family zone now, you can go in, and I can, I'll double check with Brian if we have the maps up on our site, but he's mapped all these. So we kind of, before we didn't just go blindly into saying, we need to make these all 2-family zones. We looked at kind of the composition and what was there now. And we said, you know what, the change, some of these existing regulations have been on the books for 50, 60 years, and they don't have tons of 2-family houses on there. So I think those kind of things that'll happen for going from 1 to 2, if they happen, are going to happen over time. So there's not going to be a big traffic influx as the result of that.
Well, if you're recording the comments to be passed along to the zoning committee, I'm not in favor of piecemeal two-family houses on the residential street that I live on.
Understood.
I fully support doing this kind of thing in the way some of the other towns around us, Darien, New Roten, New Canaan, all have done changes to their zoning to allow more people to live in those towns. And they've taken big parcels of land and then built those out. I don't know why Norwalk didn't take that approach. You know, I would be happy at the end of my street if you took some amount of land there. I'd be happy to have that near me. But I don't like the whole piecemeal attitude of putting it in and having it be an option. You know, one house can be one thing and something else can be something else. And just related to that, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about some of the definitions. I don't know if it was PL or SP, but special permit or permitted on a limited basis. To me, that sounds like, okay, you have a rule and then you can get permission to really do anything you want. So how do those things work?
Sure. So that's not really inconsistent with what's in the existing regulations now. And if I'm going too much in the weeds and I'm not making sense, let me know. So right now, there's really kind of three classifications of zoning permits. One is you can walk in, get an over-the-counter permit. Say you want to build a deck off the back of your house. You walk in, your plans are all compliant, you get your permit. The next one, that goes to the Planning and Zoning Commission for what's called a site plan approval. And what that kind of level is, the commission is making sure they're doing it's sort of like a check the box exercise. They're making sure that the use is okay, the building's not too big for the site, the traffic is appropriate. So there's a more documentation involved from the applicant's perspective. And then the next phase is what's called a special permit use. And the special permit use is a public hearing is required, notice to the neighbors is required, and there are additional set of criteria that an applicant has to meet. So that's when it says PL, that's consistent kind of with the site plan use, where the special permit use is consistent kind of with what we do now. So you have to go by the public hearing, notice neighbors and those kind of things. So it's not inconsistent, but it's just a little different terminology.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Sure. All right, one more, then we'll go back to Zoom and then we got about half an hour. So.
Okay, thank you, Donna Smirniotopoulos. I guess it's not a public hearing. You don't need to know that I live at 18 Shorefront Park, but for all the all the Shorefront Park people I see there and in this room, just want to identify myself as living in that neighborhood, which is currently single family only and is scheduled to be upzoned, which is a curious term, to a permit two family. I listened to some of your points about how you believe this would be gradual, but when I look in my neighborhood and I see the homes that are older, where the occupants are older, where the homes may be in need of some kind of renovation, I also consider the fact that we are in the middle of a reval and that our taxes are certainly going to go up because mine have gone up. They went up 40% after the last reval. I had nothing to do with obtaining my CO. They went up 30% with the CO. So exactly the kind of people Tanner was talking about, that we would like them to be able to stay in their homes. Those are the people who will be forced out of their homes. And they're going to be especially vulnerable to developers who want to come in and double their money, because the value in Shorefront Park of these distressed properties is tied to the land. So all of a sudden, we are going to become very attractive to developers who are going to be interested in rental property. And there are people who will pay top dollar to rent on the waterfront. So I don't think it's going to be incremental as you predict. Right now, Shorefront Park is 94% owner occupied. We struggled. I purchased my home right around Sandy. I didn't know if the neighborhood would ever come back, and it has come back. We are also 90% of us belong to the Shorefront Park Association. We have a restrictive covenant. It is recorded in the land record, volume 286, page 688 of the New York Land Records. The grantees hereby agree that neither said premises nor any building now or hereafter placed upon said premises shall be used for manufacturing, mercantile, or advertising purposes, or for any business or trade whatsoever, and that no building shall be erected on said premises except a one-family dwelling house. So I don't know how this change is going to be reconciled with the land record that is tied to Shorefront Park. I appreciate the effort to clean up the zoning. And I think if you look at these two maps, you can see that the proposed, it looks nicer, it looks cleaner, like somebody colored within the lines appropriately. But that's not reality. And as you were saying earlier, when you're looking at back lots, nobody can see from the front because nobody's looking at an aerial view. You're giving us an aerial view pitch for something that is lived at the street level. So this is why we invited the zoning commissioners to come into Shorefront Park, to walk the neighborhood, to see what makes our neighborhood different and unique. I think when I put my money down and I invested heavily in renovating my house, I was buying something. And now you're deciding, not you personally, Steve, because I know you work for the city, but other people are deciding what's best for me. And to the point about how zoning, I agree, zoning has been used to discriminate. I don't know that the Ambler decision, which enabled zoning across the country, I don't agree with Tanner that Euclid v. Ambler or Ambler v. Euclid was necessarily rooted in discrimination, because if it were, it would have been overturned already by the SCOTUS, and it hasn't been. So I think when the Supreme Court decides that Ambler was discriminatory, then we can start talking about all these things. I think a lot of what has been happened is people being kept out because of income, but not necessarily the day it is illegal to have a restricted neighborhood. It is not permitted by law. You can't keep Greeks out, you can't keep Blacks out, you can't keep Italians out, you can't keep Jews out. So that maybe that had been used in the past, but I don't really see that as a compelling argument for taking a neighborhood that is established, that is historic, that has land records that restricted to single family, and changing it. And it's not only happening in Shorefront Park, it's happening in
Can I
certain
ask you a question?
areas of East Norwalk also.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
For in that area, Shorefront, we can keep it right there. When someone's, and a lot of experience in these kind of situations, when someone who's lived on their property for 50 years and they are ready to retire, or they can't maintain their house anymore,
Or they can't afford the taxes.
or yeah, if they can't afford the taxes, what do they typically do? Who buys the house? Is it, I'm going to guess
All
that a
kinds of
big,
people.
I'm going to
Yeah.
guess that a big chunk of those houses are either completely renovated or turned down and built new.
That's it. That would be incorrect. You would be guessing incorrectly. I did that.
When
but-
I go down Shorefront Park, I see a lot of new
What
construction.
you see is that going on primarily on the waterfront. We've had turnover. We've had a bunch of turnover. I mean, I'm happy to sit down with you and talk to you about the houses that flipped where they haven't done substantial changes. There are at least a few on the waterfront. There are 3 right now on the waterfront that have not been raised. So that is not going to make sense for anybody except somebody really rich who wants a single family, or a developer who can afford to do the work. There are many other homes that I can think of a few that would be tear downs, but because housing prices are so high and the neighborhood is so desirable, there are people they're doing some interior renovations, but we're not seeing people do the level of renovation that I did. I'm sort of the anomaly there I'm sorry?
They can't without lifting it.
Right. I mean, that's the other thing is that because of the FEMA regulations, I mean, I had to put all kinds of money into my house, probably $100,000 into the ground because of FEMA and what planning and zoning told me I had to do. And now the neighborhood is going to be downgraded in order to pave the way for developers to come in. And I know it's going to happen because I know that there are many homes that are distressed. They have older owners. The taxes are going to go up.
But if, all right, but just under this one scenario, if there's an older owner there and
Many.
theoretically, per your point, that the property is now going to be worth more, that older owner is going to potentially get more money on a sale?
Yeah, they could benefit possibly, but they could benefit right now. They want to stay. The point I'm trying to make is there are people who would like to stay in their homes who don't have the money for a lift. They don't have the money to renovate. They don't want to renovate because the taxes will go up. At some point, when the tax bill goes up, the pressure is going to increase for them to sell. Or they're going to be aged to the point where it no longer makes sense for them to stay in those homes.
I have a completely different question, just to add on what she's saying, what you just said right now. Especially, let's bring it to a.
Do you mind just going?
Yeah, or I'll just speak up. What if you want, let's say if there was an older family or older couple, like, isn't the point of even longevity and generational stability in a community not for them to sell, but to have their families or
Yeah.
some type of situation have longevity to that property?
Like, why would we want to make it in a space where that older couple has?
So they don't have to. I mean, I don't think,
I'm just asking.
yeah, I don't think that would be dictated by zoning because we did. So what was one of the reasons you put in we put in the ADU legislation to allow, because if you're a single person but older and have a tough time maintaining a full house, you can live in the ADU and rent out the other piece of the house, or have your family live in the other piece of the house and you live in the basement apartment or a kind of a granny pod out back. So that option's there now. We haven't altered that at all. I think the 2-family allows options. It's not a requirement. We're not saying you have to do it. It's another option available.
Yeah, but don't people have a right to purchase in a neighborhood where they have a reasonable expectation of what their future is going to look like? And if they're choosing that they want to live in a neighborhood of single-family detached homes, that they're making that choice, why should that be taken away from them?
It's not necessarily being taken away from them. I think
The
part of
zoning-
the,
course
part of the rationale is as well, it is pointed out, we live in one of the most expensive areas in the country. This Fairfield County is super expensive, including Norwalk. It's not just Darien, Westport, Wilton. It's Norwalk as well. And we also have one of not the tightest housing market in the country. So the supply and demand plus the cost is awful. It's really hard for
I
people to do
understand that. I have a daughter in Boston. I have a son who moved to Philly because it was too expensive to stay close to home. Okay. So sometimes people move for economic reasons. So I have one child, a grown child who did that. He can't afford to buy a house here. I have a child trying to buy a home in Boston. She's going to have to look in New Hampshire because the housing market is too tight. This is what people do.
Yeah.
There's no obligation for this city and nobody else in Connecticut to make it more affordable. Why not? First of all, I would either want everything to apply to everybody, get rid of Euclid, get rid of zoning, let people do whatever they want to with their land. So you have two options, but piecemeal is not fair. It's simply not fair to do it this way.
I do want to get to, we have other, I'm happy to. if you-
Yeah, no. I could go on forever. The other thing that you said though about not adding density, I don't think that's correct, because I could have an ADU now if I could turn my garage into an accessory dwelling unit. I have to live in the house. If a developer comes in and buys a distressed property, tears it down, puts up 2 townhouses, he or she does not have to live in either one. So you are incorrect.
No, it's not an increase in density. It's not an increase in density. Zoning can't control home ownership. We can't say
I disagree.
it's an opportunity for home ownership. It's not a guarantee. Just an opportunity. That's all we can do. You want to grab the.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go with, Jody.
Jody, he's going to bring you over and then you can go ahead. Okay, Jody. Okay, go ahead, Jody.
Okay. So I live on Narragansett off of Woodward. And Steve, first of all, I just want to correct you because earlier you said that like Neptune and Baxter, Woodward, those aren't 2-family homes, or the majority 1-family homes. That's incorrect. A lot of them are 2-family homes. But I just want to kind of make a comment on the fact is that 2-family homes will bring obviously more density. The problem is that the parking situation that goes along with that. I mean, I'm all for 2-family homes. I absolutely think, it's important to allow, just to have the space for people to live. But I think it needs to be regulated. I feel like the city of Norwalk is not regulating what's happening out there. I had a 2-family home built next to mine. It is literally edge to edge, front, both sides and the back. You can barely walk between the fence and the house on 3 sides. The front of the house is all blacktop pavement for parking. They have 16 cars. Now, I know you said that you can't regulate the number of people living in the house. It's multi-generational. There are 8 bedrooms in this house, 4 bedrooms on each side. There are 16 adults living in this house, each have their own car. The street is now lined with cars because they can't fit in their parking lot that I now have to park. We have two people living in my house, two cars, one of them is in the driveway, the other one's on the grass. And if I widen my driveway, I have to increase my taxes to accommodate to this house. Now, also going back, I did receive a letter of intent when the house was built. The letter of intent said the house is going to be a 2-family house, 2 stories high. Apparently, during the course of the work, a change order was put in, and the house is now 2 3/4 or not fully 3 stories high. I never received a change of work order or a letter of intent for that. And this house appeared next to mine that was originally supposed to be 2 bedrooms on each side, is now 4 bedrooms on each side, and the number of people have increased. So basically what I'm saying is that if you're going to implement this, it needs to be strictly regulated, and there needs to be some part of the city of Norwalk that regulates. And I don't know how you do this, because I have been racking my brain over this for the last 3 years since this house was built, 4 years. How to regulate the number of people living in a house, how to regulate the number of automobiles they can have. And that density alone, I just don't think it's fair. And, what everybody's saying is going to happen. A house is going to go into disrepair. The people are going to sell it. A developer is going to come in, tear it down, and build a 2-family house because they're going to get the bang for their buck. And, it just, I just feel like the city, if they're going to implement this, they need to implement regulations on it. And that's just what I need. That's it.
Sure, thank you. I'll be quick with the response. So the zoning regulations have a definition of family, and this mimics a little bit what's in state statute. So the definition basically of family is any number of individuals related by blood or marriage. So I can live there with my sister, my brother, my aunt, my uncle, and 16 cousins. There's nothing we can do about that. That's completely legal. We can't regulate that. It's not allowed. And we can't regulate how many cars they have on their property. We can regulate where they put their parking places. That we can do. The new regulations have standards related to parking in the front yard as well as on existing properties, but would require on a new duplex, for example, that the parking would be in the side or the rear. So you wouldn't see that sea of asphalt in the front yard. That would no longer be permitted. So that's something the new regulations would clean up that the existing regulations kind of don't deal with.
So I have a question regarding that. So this house is in a flood zone. Sorry.
I want to clarify that. I don't know. So who can address that issue? It's not telling me that
How many, which,
per issue of the number of tenants?
no, if they're, it's a big distinction. If they're legally there, if I live at this house and I live there with my parents, my cousins, my aunt, my uncle, if they're related to me by blood or marriage, you cannot tell them they can be there. Sorry, it's not legal. There might be, zoning cannot do that. Health department might be if there's an occupancy issue, if there's like 15 people living in one bedroom, but health department also has limitations when it comes to single family and 2-family houses as well. Same with fire marshal, they get involved 3-family or more. So there's a big distinction there with what the law allows. So you have to be very careful with that.
So the rest of my question was, I live in a flood zone and the house has to, and I don't know if this is required in everywhere, but it had to have a 30-foot setback and it had to be raised. With the size of the house, so say that we're going to build that with these regulations in place, there is no, then the house would be at the front of the property versus the rear of the property because the parking would have to be in the back. So I'm just trying to figure out with setbacks, where is that parking going to be?
So it's in the side of the rear. The setbacks, for the most part, we didn't monkey with the front yard setbacks. We kind of kept them the same. So it's not like the houses in the 2-family zone or the 1-family zone get pushed to the street. They're still the setback. They have to reconfigure the way they design their property.
So I mean, I think that might, if the house next to me was built with these regulations, it wouldn't be able to be built. It wouldn't have been able to be built because.
Or it would have to be redesigned. It might not take the form it looks like today. It could look completely different.
They'd have to put the parking either on the side or behind, so it wouldn't have been able to be done under these new design regulations.
Correct.
Right.
So the response was, that under the new regulations, the parking would have to be the rear or the side, so it wouldn't be in the front.
But the house setback requires it to be so far back that it abuts up to the fence in the back of the house. So, and I know these are specifics, but I'm just trying to figure out, like, that might right there solve a big problem, because a lot of these houses require setbacks and there's not going to be room for parking, which could be another problem in itself.
Right. So and this goes with it. The current regulations say, if you cannot conform to the code, you cannot build what you want. It's got to meet the codes. That's kind of the short answer.
Can you just address also the fact that there was a work order change halfway through the building of this house and never received a letter of intent with the change? Is that an oversight, or if things like that happen going forward, will that be addressed?
You'd have to show me what the letter of intent is. I'm not familiar with that. If somebody's building something as of right, they're not required to notify the neighbors. So going from 2 stories to 2.5 stories is allowed within the code, so there wouldn't be any notification. If they had a variance or a special permit, then they would have to notify you. And if they modified what was approved under those conditions, that would have to go back to the commission for approval.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right, thank you, appreciate it.
Yep, we got one more, Gail, and I think then anybody else, we have a couple more minutes here. So Gail's next, and then anybody else quick. Gail, whenever you're ready, we're ready.
You know, we have 10 Q&A questions.
What's that?
You got 10 questions in Q&A.
Oh.
that are outstanding.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
If we capture the Q&A, I'll get them another day. It's
Hello?
not going to be tonight. Sure. Go ahead, Gail.
Hi. Hi, Steve, I've heard in kind of disjointed batches, some of the justifications for how the determination was made to combine B and C zones together. And I also note that not all of the B zones were combined with C zones.
Right.
So I'd like to understand in its entirety the factors that were taken into account in deciding which B zones to merge with C zones, which B zones were not being merged, and generally what the criteria were for making that decision.
Sure. And some specific geographies, might not be able to answer tonight because I don't know the existing zoning map by heart. So I have to go back and look at where each one of the existing B zone properties are. But in general, and I mentioned this earlier, we focused our growth and density around infrastructure, mass transit, and job centers. So that was kind of the guiding principle. So that's in those proximities, that's where we want the most density. As you fan out from there, we tried to make it a little less dense and then a little less dense. And then when you get to more towards the single family zone. So a good example of this would be, I could probably pull it up in a map, but along Westport Ave, where there is what's called the CD4C zone, which is now, I think, business number 2 zone. That's the commercial corridor. So within a 1/4 mile of that zone, we have, and it doesn't follow a 1/4 mile perfectly because we tried to follow the road network a little bit and where neighborhoods were. So we didn't want to like split up things when we could try to keep them more consistent, but we tried to provide like a 1/4 mile buffer around that. So the idea being is you're at the Route 1 corridor and it's a pretty, central area. It's got its own density factors, but then before you fan out to the single family zone, there's this buffer of the 1 to 2 family versus the single family. So that's kind of the logic there. With the B and the C zones, not all the B zones are in proximity to C zones. It's just the way some of the areas worked. I think and I don't know for sure, but where some of these zoning boundaries were laid out were just kind of in response to where things developed over time. It's pretty interesting to go back and look at some of the old zoning for like East Norwalk, for example, which used to allow a lot more density and a lot more height throughout a big chunk of it. And that was kind of scaled back over time and is kind of modified since then. So when the B zones were abutting C zones, a lot of times those were combined. There are some B zone properties that are nowhere near C zones. So we didn't just say, okay, we're going to make this a 2-family zone. We tried to combine that with the B and A to make what's called the CD3S, which is still a single family zone, but it's a less smaller single family zone, less lot width required. So that's kind of like a lot of the background. If you have specific areas you want to talk about, it might be easier to email me and I can look at those specifically and answer any, area questions that way.
Well, I live in Shorefront Park, so I'm curious as to why my neighborhood was chosen to be combined with another zone where similar neighborhoods were not.
Well, Shorefront Park is a pretty short walk to the train station. It's not very far. It's surrounded by multifamily or 2-family already. It doesn't make sense to leave a little pocket of single family zones surrounded by multifamily zones. If Shorefront Park was on the outskirts and abutting it was single family, then you could probably make the argument, but it's almost like a circle in the middle of the donut.
Well, first of all, it's not in the middle. It's all the way out on the edge of the river. So that's an inaccurate statement, number one. Number two, I echo some of the comments that were made earlier. If those were the only considerations as to whether or not to combine B and C and to allow multifamily housing in these neighborhoods that were formerly single family housing, I think that you have forgotten to take into account a very significant issue, which is infrastructure. We have regularly, our water mains break all the time because we've had houses that have gone up in this area and we have more people living in our neighborhood already. People have already gone over the parking issue. We have no room for parking. Our street is barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass one another. And I think that to have done this without taking into account the fact that the infrastructure can't support that increase in density is an error.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. Wouldn't look at it that way because I don't think it is an increase in density. If you can already do an ADU there and you can do a 2-family, I don't look at that as an increase in density.
Our property sizes are too small for people in this neighborhood to put an ADU in.
Well, then that property also might then be too small to put a 2-family in too.
Well, under the current regulations, it is. Under the new ones, it might not be.
I don't think so. I think it's just because the lot width, another thing, the lot width between the B and the C is the same. So it's already the same width. So that piece doesn't change. You're not going to be able to cut out new lots and build new 2-families. It's either going to be somebody trying to, given the age of some of the housing stock, my guess is they probably, if they were going to build a 2-family, they're going to scrape what's there and they're going to build a new 2-family. And at that point, they need to completely comply with the parking requirements as well as the other code requirements for the 2-families that are proposed.
Where in the design, you talked about design, is there somewhere in the document we could,
Yeah.
not tonight, but just where you could go see what you say there are some design requirements for townhouses now?
Yeah, if I can navigate that in 5 minutes, I'll navigate that in 5 minutes.
So I don't like that one.
Well,
I don't want to have.
it's just kind of subjective. It's either do it to everybody
Yeah,
or
exactly.
do it to
Everybody,
nobody.
do it to nobody. But this sort of piecemeal because you want the colors to match doesn't make any sense.
Well, so form-based doesn't we're not looking at the color, we're looking at the form. So we're looking at the massing of the building, the scale of the building, as well as the, orientation interaction with the street. So I apologize for scaling. I can't see this.
Is there a height, in terms of current zoning, was there a height, if someone's gonna try and take a single family lot? No, but is there a height limitation? I'm just curious, when you're talking about the design, because he's looking this up, I'm just filling time. Is there a height, like, could you suddenly build an 8-story next to a single family? I mean, what's the height limitation on a townhouse next to a single? family?
Yeah, I think I found it.
I'm just filling-
Oh, but it's a great question.
I'm just filling in the dead time.
Well, so fine, but I understand the plan.
He's looking up, he can't answer your question until he answers mine.
Oh, then it might be actually duplex. I'm sorry, I don't have it right in front
I'm
of me.
just trying to understand the height, just trying to understand the height.
I found the small version. I want to try to find the big version. I think I'm close.
You know, maybe there's nothing to worry about if they're height, I mean, like what you're saying, maybe it's all.
Yeah, here you go. I got it.
Store in a teacup. I would love it to be a store in a teacup.
All
but
right.
I don't think it is.
So this is the duplex. Uh, So just to answer, I can answer piece question on there, parcel question, I should say. The height doesn't change, 2.5 stories.
Does that have a number? I mean,
Doesn't have a number, but the story is regulated. The height of each story is regulated. I got to go to another.
It's something like 12 feet for the first story and 10 for the second, right?
Yeah, we tried to match up the heights to be pretty consistent. So there's not a big change. If it's a couple of feet, it's a couple of feet. It's not 5 feet, it's not 10 feet, it's a couple of feet. So it's, for the most part, it's similar. And the reason for that, and I didn't explain it, but the reason it's similar perception thing with lot width versus lot area. Most people perceive stories as versus they perceive height. I could tell you 35 feet or 40 feet. If you're 50 feet away, you have no idea what the difference is. But if you can see the building and it's got level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, then you know it's tall or it's not tall. So that's the reason for looking at that. Yeah. We're getting close. I'm getting summoned out, so I have to pack up too. So if they're super quick,
Mine's
we'll
quick,
do
yeah.
super quick.
So I wanted to speak to the issue of the restrictive covenants. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not sure what the Connecticut law is, but I do know that in Houston is famous in the United States for having very little zoning. But what Houston does have is a fairly robust system of allowing neighborhoods to self-organize and create restrictive covenants for examples like Shorefront Park. So again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't know exactly how that would work under Norwalk or Connecticut code, but like there's precedent for that. So maybe that could be a solution for Shorefront Park. I don't know.
I have a quick question as an example,
Thanks,
because
Tanner.
there's a lot of talk about tearing things down, so, but, so just to take my house as an example, it's got a fair number of square feet. It's, it's non-conforming in some respects, but I couldn't build a 2-family house because it's in a B residence. If they're combined, as a matter of right, can I just declare that it's now going to be a 2-family house? I'm not tearing it down. I'm just going to put in a second entryway and a kitchen. Does that connect become a 2-family house now because it's now permitted in the zone,
No, you have to comply with the standards for that.
even with no exterior changes?
Right. If you're gonna make it a duplex or whatever you're gonna call it,
Duplex, just a 2-family house.
you'd have to provide compliant parking spaces, which we would say they'd have to be in the rear.
I've got enough parking.
Yeah.
Or the parking, I've got the parking.
So if you're just doing an internal we have to take a look at obviously what you're
Well,
proposing,
there's a lot of
but
houses in Shorefront Park that could just do an internal conversion. So if you put in another door and a kitchen, can you do that under the current, under the?
you can do that as an ADU right now, right? With,
No, as a 2-family house, can you do it? Can you take, under the new regulations, if they becomes combined C and B, can you just put in another door? And as long as you have the parking and everything else is non-conforming, so there's no exterior change, can you put in a second door or use a second door that's already there and put a kitchen in and say it's a 2-family?
I would say technically you could,
Not
provided technically you can, provided you meet all the standards for the duplex and then for the 2-family in that zone, then yes. But I'd have to
So
look
you
at the
could. So
specific,
every single family that's got enough parking.
if they meet all the standards,
Well,
correct.
the standards are you put in another kitchen and you use the cellar door and the front door.
Technically, you could do that today. as an ADU.
Because it's in a B zone,
You can do an ADU in the B zone today.
huh?
You can do an ADU in the B zone today.
No, but that's an exception.
No, it's as of right.
What is it?
It's an accessory dwelling unit. It's an apartment. You
Right,
could
but
do
I don't
that.
want to do an accessory dwelling. I want to do a two-family, full two-family. Couple of bedrooms.
Yeah, you could do that with an ADU too, though. I mean, there's not a big difference. It wouldn't be a big change. The only difference would be if you did a true two-family, you wouldn't be restricted by the size of that second unit where the ADU has a cap on the size.
I see.
That's the only difference. And then the
Well, thank you for
two-family would
answering the
have
question.
2 parking spaces.
Thank you.
Yep. I'm being cut off. I'm happy to chat with you while I'm packing up, but he's telling me.
I just wanted to add, really quickly, I think that Tony Lopez, the draconian measures that are being taken should really be reconsidered. Most people have a concern for density. The inevitability of density will affect us with the roads. And there's something that hasn't even been given any concern, which is our natural resources with water, which is limited. And that has to be considered.
Thank you. All right, thank you, everybody.
We let you get out alive.